Well, while vegan activists have been struggling to find the most effective way to get people to stop eating animals, today's guest has a unique approach to this problem. While he was in college, Brian Kateman learned about the damage animal agriculture does to the planet and human health, and he immediately became an environmentalist. He then sought to empower people to change their dietary patterns, but in a way that was not so all or nothing. Brian coined the term Reducetarian with his friends, which means a person who is deliberately reducing his or her or they consumption of meat. And he co-founded the Reducetarian Foundation, a nonprofit spreading this message. Brian is also the author of Meet Me Halfway, where many of you listeners may know him from, which attempts to create common ground at the dinner table, and is also the co-director and producer of the documentary film of the same name, which was obviously made from the book. He's a regular contributor to Forbes and Entrepreneur, and his writings have appeared in the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the Los Angeles Times. We are very excited to talk with Brian today about this subject matter that is so diverse and wild and hard to traverse that we're gonna have fun doing it, Brian.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
What do you think, or certainly what you've learned over the course of your career in doing this type of work? What is that central theme in maybe in people's DNA or personality types, or their scope of reference of the life that they've led thus far, that make them so resistant to change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's the question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we all want there to be a world where there's as little or no suffering at all. And because of the way we raise animals for food, whether it's because of environmental damage or human health issues, or of course the animals themselves in these factory farms, there's just a tremendous amount of suffering that exists, which is why I'm drawn to try to help people struggle to cut back on animal products for all sorts of reasons. I mean, there's an evolutionary history with meat. We have, I think, a sort of inherent attraction to this idea of, I don't know, being around a campfire and seeing that, meat burning within it. There's all sorts of cultural ties. I think about growing up and eating a hot dog at a baseball game with my dad, or eating turkey on Thanksgiving or ham on Christmas or whatever it is. The meat companies themselves have made meat sort of supercharged in their taste. They've loaded in salt and sugar in terms of the buns and the fast food restaurants and fat. And it's just, for many people, even though they may care about these issues, they struggle to make the change. And when I think about changes that I've tried to make in my life and not always done a perfect job, I can harness compassion for that. I have friends who tell me to meditate more. I'm like a pretty high-strung, anxious person. Maybe that would solve that. Or maybe I should exercise more, or maybe I should call my mom more, or I should walk my dogs more. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we could do to be better people. But it is the case that we eat too many animal products. We raise animals in conditions that are beyond cruel and that are not kind to the planet and people's health. And we're going to have to find solutions that enable us as a society to move away from eating as many animal products as we do, despite some of the resistance and challenges that we've seen in modern day society for those reasons that I've highlighted, but also a host of other reasons as well.
Why do you feel that asking people to reduce their consumption of meat and dairy is a better tactic in the long run for animals and the planet and humans than advocating for the elimination?
I mean, the truth is that I support a diversity of messages. Different messages are going to respond to different audiences. But it is the case that there are a lot of people who are not vegan, and there are a lot of people who've heard vegan messaging, and for reasons that I find annoying and sad, are not persuaded by that message. So I do think we need an alternative message on the table, which would be around encouraging people to cut back on the amount of animal products that they consume. Unfortunately, for many people, asking them to go vegan in their brain registers as what? Give up everything that I love? What do you mean? I love spending time with my family on Thanksgiving, and my grandma makes these amazing cookies, and she'll be so sad if I don't eat those cookies that have eggs in them. And all my friends go out to these restaurants, and what do you mean? I don't like eating vegetables. They taste bad. Like, there's all of these anxieties and fears that a lot of people may experience if they encounter that kind of message. And I have found it's the case that if you lean in to well, why don't you just try having a plant-based meal today? Like, just one, like, just try having, I don't know, avocado toast this morning instead of your usual egg and bacon breakfast, right? Or maybe try a Beyond Burger or Impossible Burger. Just see how you feel. Maybe you'll be able to do more. Maybe you can do Meatless Monday or vegan before 6 or weekday vegetarian. Maybe you see how you feel after doing that for a week or 2 or 3. I have found that is a gentler, more inviting message at times than a go vegan message. We've also done some studies that do suggest it is true that among certain populations, an eat less meat message is more effective at getting them to actually cut back on the amount of animal products that they consume than a go vegetarian message. So at the end of the day, I want to reduce societal consumption of animal products to the greatest extent possible. And I want to use the most effective tools to make that happen. And certainly, I think there's a place for a sort of moderate, inviting kind of message rather than telling people to cut out animal products entirely.
It seems like people are like, it just, it's like they're allergic to the idea of perfectionism, right? And having to be perfect. And I think it's because but it's just veganism is tied in for so many people to a diet, and we fail our diets all the time. And that's why the supplement industry, to help you do all these things to change your body, is $80 billion a year. People want something that's easy. They want a pill, and they want to try to be able to do it in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of effort. And, but they don't want to be held to some like perfectionistic board. And so it feels like it's whenever I have the conversations with people and I offer some of the options that you just offered, once a week, 3 times a week, just in the morning, just at night, on Saturdays, it's like, and I kind of I'm like saying sorry to the animals the whole time I'm speaking these ridiculous ideas now. It is just so much more digestible. And they go, oh, like, you mean I could just do it sometime? It's like, you can do it anything you want. It's not, it just feels so, incredibly militant to people, which is why I think people have issues with the word vegan, is because they know that they are going to have to, or eventually probably be exposed to the whole rabbit hole. Like, they're aware that it's so much more than just the food on their plate.
I think you're right. And, humanity in a lot of ways is not very good. And I don't mean that in a sort of pejorative sense. It's just hard for many people to live a moral existence. They want to be happy, and what makes them happy in their otherwise challenging day, whether it's because they're working or life is hard for everybody, right?
Yeah.
They want to eat the bacon. They want to eat the chicken. They want to eat the fish, and they don't want to be told not to eat the foods that they love, even if some part of them knows that the way animals are raised for food and the way it impacts all of us is immoral. And I don't like that reality, right? I'm just the messenger. It's just the truth about where we're at. And so the question I find myself asking and trying to come back to is, what can we offer people, even if it may feel frustrating, or even if it may feel a betrayal of our own values? You mentioned apologizing to the animals, right? I mean, all we can do is try to reduce as much suffering as possible. That's something I've learned in therapy over the years. Like, you go into therapy and you have this frustration with a person. And one of the things you learn, you can't change people. Like, you can't force people to do what you want to do. This isn't a reality of life, right?
It's so frustrating.
It's so frustrating, of course. But so all we can do is, one, we can plant seeds in people and give them the information. And we can try to change the external environment around us so it's easier for people to act on the wishes that we may have or they may even hold in themselves. But there's no message that will force people to be compelled to do something unless it's through law, right? And that's why there are other strategies we can use. We can talk about those later. But it really is important to remember that we're not all powerful. We just have to do the best we can. And learning to accept that is really hard, but has actually been quite helpful for me and is what I try to lean into when I'm thinking about, okay, what should I say? Or what should I promote? What can I tell my friends and family? What can I tell people that I meet? If they're not willing to go vegan, I don't want to tell them to do nothing. I want to tell them to do something. And even if that's come over to my house this one time and I'm going to make you a delicious vegan meal, that's one meal at least they're doing what I want in terms of the wishes I have.
Yeah. It's very freeing to cut yourself some slack.
Yeah, it is because it's exhausting to if your way of measuring yourself is everybody doing what I want them to do, that is a recipe for burnout real fast.
Yeah.
I remember I tend to be an all or nothing person, but it took me a long time to go vegan from vegetarian. So I have empathy for people. And I do understand why they don't feel they have the bandwidth to focus on that in their life. Like you said, they want to be happy and they're so stressed in other areas. It just seems like it's just easier to eat meat or just have that cookie. I remember I heard Graham Hill, who's an environmentalist who founded treehugger.com, and he did this TED talk. I think it's called Weekday Vegetarian. He basically says the same thing. He's got the same message that you do. At the end of his talk, he looked at the audience and he said, if all of us ate half of us much meat, that would be the same as half of us eating no meat. And I really thought that made a lot of sense because to the animals, that means a lot. But on the other hand, my concern is that the system remains the same. The acceptance of exploitation of animals remains the same. So I was really happy to hear in the beginning, Brian, that you consider the reducetarian strategy one of many, and that it will be heard by people who might not be sort of all or nothing.
Related to this idea that maybe we might want to try to get a large amount of people to cut back rather than exclusively focus on getting a small number of highly committed people to go vegan. It's also important to recognize that all motivations are valid too, at least from the perspective of the animals that are in those systems. Like even if someone goes, cuts back because of their health, or they cut back because they want to save money, or they cut back because of the environment, the animals don't care why they're not being born into existence and tortured, right? So it also relates to this idea of using not just different messages with respect to degrees of reduction, but also using different messages with respect to motivation. So I come at this with an appreciation that this is a really hard thing to do, and we need a diversity of messages and strategies to try to make it happen. And it will be messy, and sometimes those strategies will conflict with each other, and I acknowledge that. But we're going to have to muddle through to try to do the best that we possibly can to reduce the amount of suffering, both animal and human, in the world.
On just right on that topic, on like the diversity of the reasons people go vegan, I've been asking myself this question a lot lately on, is there a hierarchy of reasons for some people or even most people? And is there a best entry point reason and then a best sticky reason? And let me set this up for you. The question started percolating because documentaries do great work in this movement. And right after the game changers, for about a year, probably a little bit more, probably more like a year and a half, every conversation I have with somebody say, oh yeah, I saw that. Oh my gosh. Yeah, totally changed. I feel awesome. Like I'm doing it. I'm in it. It's, and then all of a sudden there was this shift to every conversation that I was having at about a year and a half or so after the film came out. And it changed to, oh yeah, I saw that film, was good. I did that for a while. You're like, oh, what happened? I said, and mainly it was it started just to becoming too hard. I couldn't, it became boring to my taste buds. And the third reason was it was just like a pain at restaurants with my friends and family. Like I just didn't want to deal. And I didn't want to like be the weird person that was like, hey, waiter, I need, that whole thing. And so that was it was profound to literally that the shift was everyone was saying they're in it, they're doing it. And then like I hardly talk to anyone now that's like still doing it, that saw the film, except for they're obviously they're out there, thank goodness, but there's not a lot of my conversations are, and so it started to beg the question for me, entry point reasons, health. If somebody has a heart attack, then, that they'll change. And a lot of times it's very sticky, the health reason. It will stay health because they have had a heart attack and they went through almost dying. But if they haven't had one themselves and they've just heard that you might be able to have a heart attack from eating too much steak, kind of like your dad talks about in the film, right? Like if you told me I was going to have a heart attack tomorrow, he's like, I wouldn't have a steak tonight, right? Like this is not happening. But it's kind of like, yeah, really, am I really going to, when am I going to have this heart attack? Like, I don't know. I'm going to enjoy the steak beforehand, whatever it might be. And so I'm always wondering and curious if there's best entry points, but then I can't find a better sticky than the animals, because people give up on themselves time and time again. So if it's like health and wellness or even the environment, and I got to admit, I'm not too far away from being similar to your mom and dad with the environment. I mean, I want there to be a planet, but I also feel like I'm probably going to be out before it really blows up. And I don't have any kids to worry about. It's just, I get when your mom was like, it's hot this summer, but it was like pretty hot 10 summers ago too. It's hard. You're like, yeah. But I'm looking outside at the ocean right now and it's pretty out there. Like, is it, are we sure it's not okay? So it's not, the reasons for self and the reasons for humanity, just don't seem to be that sticky.
I think this is a really important and real. I really appreciate you saying this point, because look, the data I've seen suggests that if people do cut back or go vegan for the animals, they are much more likely to stick with it in the long term. So I think that's completely real from the data that I've seen. Yeah. I think that is powerful and an indication that we need to try to get people to actually grapple with the ethics, which is, of course, meaningful. The first book I read that got me interested in this topic was a book called The Ethics of What We Eat by Peter Singer and Jim Mason. And I was an environmentalist or at least I cared about environmental issues from the perspective of, climate change and biodiversity loss. And I was taking shorter showers and I was walking instead of driving and these sorts of things. But I didn't really know much about the food system. And of course, I was interested to learn about how factory farming impacted those environmental issues. But I did feel a part of me change, thinking about, it's not just, wild animals that I care about, or my cat at the time. I also do care about pigs and chickens and so on. And maybe it's wrong that we're eating this. And having that ethical awareness, I think, was a contributing factor to sort of pushing me over the edge into really caring about this issue in a profound way. At the same time, and this is the part where I say something that's kind of unfortunate, is that a lot of people don't care about animals. And a lot of people don't care about humanity. And they really care about themselves. And I don't like that about humanity. If you follow my work, I'm not exactly the biggest promoter of humanity's virtues. But so the question I have, like with someone with my dad, for example, who says in the film, and still to this day says, like, I'm not a humanitarian, Brian, what can I tell you? He's not worried about, certainly not worried about, the suffering that chickens goes through, no matter how many times I show him, footage or what's going on. My dad it just doesn't seem to click. And so I'm left with two options, I think. One is to give up, which I'm not going to do, or go with a message that will resonate with him, even if it creates short-term gains or only small amounts of gains over the long term. So I will lean into health messaging. I will say to him, your dad died at 59. I don't want you to die at, 59 or 69 for that matter. Please, you have to eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, Dad. That kind of message will work on him. But I like the realism that you're bringing, that it's really hard to get people to make the changes that we need to get them to make. And different messages have different strengths and weaknesses.
Okay.
By the way, I just want to add that your father did say also in the film, which is a great film. I recommend people watch it. I watched it on Amazon Prime, and it's Meet Me Half. What's the website, Brian? meetmehalfway.com?
Meetmehalfway.org.
.org. You can find more information about it there. But he does say that he cares very much about you, his daughter, his wife, his patients. So it's not like he's a man who doesn't care. It's just that he's choosing what he feels like he doesn't have the bandwidth to care for other things. He probably would care very much for his dog if he had one, and wouldn't be horrified if his dog was slaughtered the way cows or pigs are in factory farms. So just to mention, we have to acknowledge that people can be good. We had somebody on the show talking about this, can be really good people, but still not care about I mean, there are things that I don't care about, like Dotsie said, that I don't deal with, kids in hospitals with cancer. A lot of times because the research for that cancer is done on animals, so I can't participate. But so, I mean, I'm sure people look at me and go, well, she doesn't care about those kids. Right. It's just that I've chosen to look another direction and work in another direction. Right.
I think you're right. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting thing, right? Like, I love my dad, and I love my parents, and I love my friends who, the vast majority are not vegan or vegetarian. I mean, they've cut back because of me, I think, right? But, people are complicated. And I don't think it means that people fall into the box or good or bad. I don't really think that's a helpful construct. I think it's morally better if people don't eat, animals, particularly those from factory farms. I think it's better if people care about ethical issues more broadly, even beyond just, issues related to our food system. But life is challenging. People are busy. And also not every person is built psychologically to and intellectually to necessarily engage or care at those issues. I do think what's interesting about what you mentioned about not sort of caring about everything, which of course, nobody can care about everything, but I will defend you for fun in one particular way, which is that I really think that there is no system on the planet that creates as much suffering as factory farming, which is why I've decided to spend my life working on it. There are lots of different wrongs that exist in the world, but in terms of the volume and the severity of the wrong, it is very difficult to find an issue that is as dramatic or intense as the one that you've also chosen to focus on. So there is that.
And most people would agree with you, actually, that I have never met anyone who says factory farms are good places for animals. They will justify it by saying it's the only way we can feed humans. But so therein lies the rub. Like, okay, then just don't feed them that. But but I think you're right in that it's an issue that people acknowledge is awful, but they still participate in it. Yeah. And I think that's the question I wanted to ask. You mentioned it earlier. What are your strategies for, you mentioned you had strategies to reach people.
Yeah.
Can you share with us a little bit about how you could open someone's mind to consider it when they might be wanting to shut down?
Yeah. So, there's all types of different strategies to try to reduce societal consumption of animal products. And there are many that are featured in the film. What we're talking about now, I suppose, is what kinds of messages can you put out into the world to create dietary change, right? Because you don't have to rely on that. You could become a politician, and you could become a lawyer, and you could become an entrepreneur. There's so many different ways to help end factory farming. But from the context of your question, what I have found to be most helpful in terms of all the conversations I've had with probably thousands of, omnivores at this point interpersonally in my work, is that compassion for them and their experience is very useful and often an underappreciated idea. And I think it can be hard to find compassion and to be nice to sets of individuals who you are frustrated, may be frustrated with, right? If you don't like when people eat animals and they're eating animals and that irks you or irks a person, of course, that's going to be challenging. But in my experience, judging or shaming people with rare exception, because of course, not everyone is going to be the same, but most people do not respond well to being shamed or being judged. And it can be hard not to lean into that. But to the extent that I have found success, it's when I acknowledge the experience of the people that I'm speaking to and try to create a friendly, joyful opportunity for them to dip their toe in the water and try something new. And I know that is the case because it works for me most effectively. So when my friends want me to do something, or my family, when they tell me I'm a lousy person, I'm not saying it's rational, but I just have all these walls that start to come up, and that creates a distance between me and the person giving me that perspective. I also find it's really important to emphasize that people can still eat the foods that they love. I still eat burritos, right? I just add avocado instead of, chicken, or I still eat spaghetti. It's just primavera, instead of bolognese. I think that we've kind of, and maybe it relates a little bit to what you were mentioning earlier, that like you can eat food that is really delicious and may not even be that great for your own health, but doesn't torture animals and is not cruel to the planet, doesn't cause environmental damage. Like, it's fine to eat Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers, even though they're not as healthy as broccoli. Certainly from time to time. I don't know anyone who eats sort of healthy all the time. And I think that's another challenge that's come up in the vegan space, is people associate veganism with kale and quinoa. And there are lots of indulgent foods that are delicious. And I don't want anyone to eat, buckets full of those. Of course, I don't want people to increase their chance of heart disease and certain types of cancers and diabetes, of course. But I also think that leading with like, you're going to have kale salads all the time, and even imply that, is not helpful and creates a lot of anxiety and fear for people. So those are probably the two things that I try to lean into when I'm speaking to potential reducetarians of the world.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want.
If you eat kale salads, you'll start to crave kale salads, which is kind of cool, because then it's like you don't have to worry about having to eat kale because you want the kale.
You're right. You're right. And that, I agree with you. Like, and if you just, it's hard to get people to do it. But if for 3 weeks you eat foods that your taste buds are not used to, it really does change. That said, I eat, like, my diet is, in terms of being very vegan, but 90%, whole plant-based foods. Like, I'm pretty healthy, but don't get me wrong. I still indulge. I love eating, vegan junk food. There is a place for that in my life, and my life would be much sadder without it. And I don't want to be told that I can't have oil sometimes and these kind of things. I'm not that's not where I'm at in this space at all.
Neither.
Yeah. And that's perfectly fine. But certainly leaning into eating more, plant-based foods and vegans foods is important. And that was really the last leg for me, was health. I think I I had a lot of spaghetti when I first started. I was really scared of vegetables. Like I read about the ethics of factory farming. I was like, oh no, I can't have this. So I was just eating like, a lot of carbs all day long. And then I started to try different foods. I'd never had Indian food before. I'd never had Thai food before. I met my now wife and she was like, oh, you have to try these foods. It's like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like all these sauces, they're already vegan. And that's the thing. Everybody goes on a journey. I grew up eating McDonald's and Burger King and Dunkin' Donuts in Staten Island. So my parents didn't eat salads. This wasn't a thing. It just wasn't a thing. So
oh my gosh, I laughed out loud when I learned in that documentary that your parents had never tasted an avocado, and you make them some avocado toast, and it was just a very funny section. So what I love about your film is that it's very personal. I saw the conflict in your face when you went to you visit a farm that is considered a humane farm. It has thousands of animals and they have a slaughterhouse on site and they are humanely slaughtered. And we don't get to see the actual slaughter, but you were watching the slaughter in the documentary. I liked that farmer very much. And I thought that he said something very interesting. He said that his animals' deaths are so much less painful than most human beings' deaths, who linger and they're afraid and they're frail, et cetera. I thought that was a really good point. However, we have to acknowledge that those animals don't choose their deaths. That's a big issue. Tell us what you think about humane meat, because it felt like you sort of are like me, where you can see the why, he's doing God's work and what he believes is God's work. But at the same time, didn't sit right with you.
Yeah. Will Harris is a really interesting person. And in many ways, I think a hero. He inherited a farm that was raising animals in a factory farmed setting with how 99% of animals are raised in the United States and, something like at least 90% globally. These animals characterized by factory farms, I'm sure your listeners know everything from being encaged to never be seeing grass to, being mutilated, just the cruelest kinds of conditions, right? And also environmentally degrading the land and the air along the way. And what Will did was he sort of turned back the clock and he created a much more humane existence for these animals. So they're not castrated. They're allowed to, reproduce on their own. They're not in cages. They have full access to pasture. His farm is certainly better than a factory farm. And there's really no question about that. The problem, aside from the slaughter, which we can talk about, which was the worst thing I've ever seen in person in my lifetime, despite being much more compassionate and humane than a factory farm. The way the factory farm slaughters animals was the worst thing I've ever seen, and stays with me to this day, both the visuals and the smell and lots of other really awful things. It's very difficult, and that's almost a euphemism for to scale this, because the meat that Will Harris has is really, really, really expensive. A turkey from Will Harris is like $170. When you go to Turkey on Thanksgiving, it's like $30 from, your grocery store or something like that. So it's just, from a price perspective, it's really hard. And there's just not enough land to create the kind of a supply that would be needed to meet that demand. So, even if folks support high welfare, regenerative meat, they have to acknowledge that meat reduction is going to be a major part of that, dramatic meat reduction. It's just not going to be possible for people. The slaughter itself is interesting. And your point is interesting, because I often think about this, and this is now a tangent, but I'll take it. I do often think about how humans don't have a lot of, end of life care, which makes me really sad. My dogs, on probably one of the worst days of my life, I will take them to a vet who will administer a drug that, essentially will euphemize, puts them to sleep, right? And I think Will, in an interesting way, is right that it's an odd place where we and otherwise don't really treat humans as well as we do some animals. That said, of course, those animals are perfectly healthy. They don't, their time is not ready for that. They're also not given a drug. They're given the equivalent of like a bullet to the brain and then stabbed to give them cardiac arrest. And they don't need to be brought into existence for that experience. So, of course, there are differences between those systems. But the thing I always come back to is reduction. No matter what your utopic vision for the world is, you called it God's work, or he might think it's God's work. No matter what you're doing, in order to create a humane, sustainable, healthy food system, it does not involve us eating over 200 pounds of meat a year per person. It simply does not. So we have to see dramatic animal product reduction in order for us to advance any kind of vision for the food system that any reasonable person would call idyllic, even if some of those idyllic visions disagree with each other.
And if it is that dramatic, they will go out of business. So if it's as dramatic as you're speaking about, it will most of it will end. Maybe not Will's farm for the really
when you
privileged.
Say dramatic, Betsy, what do you mean dramatically expensive? Or?
No, a very dramatic reduction in meat consumption. If there's no more demand, they will close down. This is the thing. It's like without factory farms, if there are no factory farms, there just will not be a lot of meat available. Right.
And so what'll happen is the meat will be extremely expensive. And we know this because that's history. If you go back to 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, there were no factory farms. It didn't exist. There was very little supply. We barely had the ability to send meat far distances. We didn't have refrigeration or ice boxes to store this meat. It was just and this is something that's covered in the book version of Meet Me Halfway. Like, we have a long history of people wanting to eat lots of meat, but it just not being available. And that's why it's just the reality that if people are against factory farms, which most people are, you better be prepared to eat a significantly decreased amount of animal products. And you should be.
The human population, Datsy knows this is an issue close to my heart, is growing very fast and will be over 10 billion, pretty much no matter what we do. That means that even if we reduce our meat, we're still going to be eating a lot of animals because there's going to be more. And as the poorer countries get more developed, and we want the poorer countries to get those folks to get a better lifestyle, one of the things that they believe is that eating meat is something that they aspire to, that societies that get richer aspire to. So reducing might not help us at all. It might not help the animals at all unless we reduce dramatically.
Well, the thing is that it depends what you mean by help, because I am not the most optimistic person in nature. And by that, I mean, I don't necessarily know if we're going to have a world in which there's no factory farms, let alone a world in which is, a vegan world. What I want to do is decrease the number of animals that are raised in those systems. And by that, I am signaling to you that I have lower expectations than a lot of people do, I think, in this movement. So there is value in reducing the amounts of animal products that a person consumes, in that it will help reduce the number of animals that are in those systems. I don't know if we'll be able to solve climate change. I don't know if we'll be able to end factory farming. I don't know if we'll be able to, reverse the trend in people, dying from preventable diseases. But I do think this is not an all or nothing premise. If we can, reduce societal meat consumption counterfactually, like, let me explain this better. Right now, people are eating 227 pounds of meat in the United States, right? Let's say
in
each year.
A year. Let's say that next year it is projected to go up to 229 pounds per year. I would like to try to get it to only go up to 228 pounds per year. That one extra pound, when we're talking about, billions of animals, is huge. Now, people would say, what do you mean, Brian? You want to get it to be that meat consumption is going up? Well, it depends what the alternative is.
Right.
Less harm is better than extra harm. And although I would love to say that next year I expect meat consumption to go down, that's not what I expect will happen. And that's not the trend that I expect will take place. So I think the real goal certainly in the short term is to slow the amount of animal products that are consumed, and for us to work toward more systemic solutions that may actually achieve what many would describe as our shared dream, which would at least be to end factory farming and significantly reduce societal consumption of animal products. And some of the tools that I'm most excited about in that sense are perhaps plant-based meat, cell cultured meat, many of which are some of those companies are featured in the film.
I'm going to ask about that, but I got to say, I feel like the episode title is less harm is better than extra harm. I like that. I like the way it rings.
I often say a very bad world is still better than a very, very bad world.
Yeah.
Not as pithy as you put it, but that's
Right.
something I often say.
Yeah, no, it's straight up the truth. I have some questions about cultured meat and just society accepting it, but I wanted to go back to the slaughter at Will's farm. As you said, it was the most awful thing you'd ever seen. Have you seen a lot of really, really awful things?
And life as a whole? That's a really
Just
good question. Look, I've seen things that have made me really sad. In the film, I also see pigs be sent to slaughter, and that was really hard and sad. And I think about those pigs that I saw.
Both Dotsie and I have been to that pig vigil, so we can relate exactly to what you're feeling.
Yeah, no, it was a really difficult experience, and interestingly, very bad in a different way than the slaughterhouse was. And I think that's, as I reflect on this experience, I actually can't quite describe why, but there's something truly repulsive about watching someone kill another individual. And of course people are listening to this like, what do you mean? Of course it's repulsive, but I don't mean intellectually. Like, I mean, my body wanted to vomit. It's something so primal where there's just like this terrible, terrible feeling, and to watch it and feel as though you can't really do anything about it and almost be frustrated by that too is different than watching pigs be sent to slaughter, even though they're both bad. There's also like the smell of being in a slaughterhouse is more pungent than even being in the very bad smelling environment of watching pigs be sent to slaughter. It's this very unnatural, where I'm sure we have evolved to not want to be in that environment for many reasons, including for health related reasons. So I think there are lots of things that I've seen that are intellectually really awful that I'm very upset about. My wife and I were, walking the other day, and we saw, some roadkill on the street, and that was very upsetting to me. And intellectually, it makes me sad to think about all these animals that are in the wild that are suffering or that experience harm from us. But nothing quite as viscerally awful as seeing that cow slaughtered, seeing that cow killed, particularly watching a knife be plunged into that individual's body. It was just very, very, very awful.
It's so intensely physical and so bloody. One thing I always, for some reason, I just think of all the time, and I wish I wouldn't, because I don't know, it's not a lot I can do about it in this exact moment, but is the animals that come after. So on Will's farm, where it's humane, because I'm real positive in factory farms, because I've seen too much footage, the next one is right there. So, and you see them fight, right? Because they know. Does he have them lined up, or is it like, here's Susie and really far away is Jane, and we're going to go out and get her and bring her in and kill her? Like, I'm always wondering in the real environment that's not on film, which you were in, where are all the other ones that are coming next?
That's a really good question. And I don't want to speak for White Oak Pastures, so I don't remember how many animals they kill per day.
Yeah.
So that's something that I can't speak to, but I do think your question underscores something meaningful, which is that it's really difficult to raise animals for food in a way that one would call humane. I mean, once you
Yeah.
start looking at the details, but that's the thing. I'm not really interested personally in utopia. And I don't mean that in a dismissive or derisive way. I'm just
with you.
trying my best to think about how to make the world as humane as possible, given the constraints that I was born into. And that will always fall short of my ideals, always. But I would prefer to pursue that than that is at least maybe possible than to dwell on something that I personally think is going to be much harder to achieve, certainly in the near future. But again, when we take a longer term vision, who knows what will be 200 or 500 or 1,000 years from now. But right now, most people eat factory farm meat. They don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. If I could get people to eat a couple more servings of the good stuff instead of the bad stuff, that would be a job well done in my book.
Mm-hmm.
I recommend the book Every 12 Seconds, which is about a slaughterhouse, and DT details, undercover journalist details the slaughter process and how modern slaughter has to separate every action in the killing and parting out of the parts of an animal so that no one person feels like they killed an animal. The worst job in the slaughterhouse, everyone said, and was the person who administered the bolt that Brian talked about to the animal, which first stuns. But then that person says, "Oh no, I just stunned him." So him or her, and then the person who stabs feels like they didn't really kill them because the stunner did it. So it's interesting how slaughter is, I think most people would react like Brian, and that's why we have to separate ourselves so much from our food system. But Dotsie, speaking of separating from the food system, talk about, ask your question that you were going to ask about cell-based meats.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a solution, and I like the idea, although most of us vegans won't be partaking because I don't crave it. I don't want it. I don't need it. I've, lived way too long without it to go back in. But I completely understand and get the concept that, if we can switch the meat eaters over to that. I just, after the thousands of conversations I have had with people that drink milk and consume dairy, so much of their verbiage is around the natural and the whole and the nutrition from that animal and the belief system that they have that you talk a lot about in the film and our viewers know a lot about. I have not ever had anybody able to answer this question on the marketing, because that's what it's going to take once we get it down to a affordable hamburger. We're still a little ways away, but getting closer and closer. How this marketing is going to go to convince meat eaters to switch over to this very strange, in a lab produced micro cell in a petri dish grown by weird people with lab coats that walk around when they think a Beyond Burger is weird.
Well, hopefully you won't be writing the copy for the marketing involving the cell culture meat, because you didn't describe it very deliciously based on the descriptions you used. But I understand your point. I understand your point. It's really interesting how some of these different strategies that we use sort of conflict with each other. Like on the one hand, we say that it's easy for people to cut back on animal products or go vegan because there's so many delicious foods available. But then we're saying, well, but we get you don't want to really eat those things, so we're going to spend a lot of resources to try to get you to eat.
Make this other thing
that imitates the experience that you're used to. And to some extent, I think that conflict is very intellectually interesting. And on the other, I think it reflects something actually quite beautiful, which is that we should be humble about how difficult this is and that we need different strategies because we don't know what's going to work. I mean, you even said, once cell cultured meat, becomes affordable, but I would even push on that and say, if because I don't know if it's going to be
Good point.
affordable.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I don't know if
the government subsidizes it like they subsidize our
Right.
meat industry,
Right.
Yeah.
and oil.
and to its extent that we should be optimistic about that, I don't know, but we have to try. I think there's a place for cell cultured meat. I think it will allow people to be themselves, but not be participating in the exploitation of animals, particularly in factory farms. And I would love to see a world in which people switched from eating that to cell cultured meat. But I agree. I think that you will start to see companies say how delicious meat is. You will see companies see how nutritious it is. You're going to see a really interesting kind of messaging that will go against what some other people in our movement want.
Perfect Day seems to really push the that how great milk is, and I'm thinking, wow, I've always been talking about how it's not healthy for you. So it's hard for me to push Perfect Day on one hand and say milk is really unhealthy for you on the other hand.
It's completely fair, and it resonates with me. And I'm in the somewhat fortunate position that whenever I'm talking about health related claims, I have the no-brainer messaging, which is that we eat way too many animal products. We don't eat enough plant-based foods. That I think most people agree with. And once you start getting into more specific dietary advice, people like to cherry pick and pull on different kinds of messaging. So, but this is the thing, and I come back to this. Even in a world in which people are eating cellular agriculture products, we might still, and I expect that we will still need to see a significant reduction there, because I think it's going to be hard to create the volume that we need to create, particularly at the price point that we need to create it. So there's just, even in that world, it's still good if people eat more plant-based foods. It's never going to change. It will always be that eating sometimes broccoli and kale and quinoa and rice and tofu and apples and on is going to be good for the world, whether it's a world without factory farms or not. And that's why no matter what strategy someone is using, it will always come back to trying to reduce societal consumption of animal products. And even if we have different ideas around what strategies we should be pursuing or what ideals we have around the food system, I am very grateful to be a part of a movement where we can all at least come together and agree that we have to at least reduce societal consumption of animal products.
Does anybody ever ask you the question if there's enough planet, if everybody switched over to plant-based, if we'd have enough planet to grow the caloric needs of wherever we are, 7.5 billion people? Yeah. Where are we? 8.5? Yeah, it's a lot of people. And it's like, I don't know. I maybe a medium-sized potatoes, it's probably 80 calories, 75, 80 calories. A burger is 250 calories. So, obviously it's much more condensed calorically. Like, is there enough room to grow all those vegetables?
People don't ask me the question. What instead they say is kind of the opposite, which is that, well, we need to eat meat because there's not enough land in order to grow other kinds of foods. And the sad reality is that is not scientifically accurate by any stretch, because we all know that animals are very resource intensive. And in order to raise animals for food, we have to grow crops that we then feed to those animals rather than feeding directly to people. And that's a very inefficient process. So for example, if you take cows, it's something like 40 calories goes to a cow before you get 1 calorie of meat out. And the reason for this is really simple. The cow is living, his or her life, moving around, burning energy. So by the time that cow gets slaughtered, a lot of energy has been lost. It's just much more efficient to feed people directly. It is truly the case that from a sort of world hunger perspective, our desire to feed people, one of the biggest problems is how much food we feed to farmed animals rather than going directly to people. So there's also the same argument, like animals in the fields, they get hurt. So why are vegans eating plant-based foods? It is true that animals do get hurt in the fields, right? When you cultivate plants, there are animals that will get hurt when you're bringing machinery, of course. Next for us, we have a lot of exciting projects on the horizon. One that's on my mind is our next annual conference is coming up, our Reducetarian Summit. This year is in Denver, Colorado, October 27th to the 29th. We've been to New York, LA, DC, and San Francisco, and I'm very excited to be bringing our event to Colorado. We are very likely going to be in Austin, Texas. That's a scoop, I think. Austin, Texas in 2024. I don't think I've shared that elsewhere. I haven't signed the paperwork yet, but it should be in the works. I'm really excited about going to the middle of the country. We have to go to places others have not. We have a fellowship program that I absolutely love. We work with undergraduate students who get mentorship and training for a year. They learn all about the problems with factory farming and ways to solve it, and then complete an internship program with one of our residency partners, which is very exciting. I'm writing a lot. Cool. I've got burned out from writing books, but I'm working on a lot of op-eds, and you will continue to see me place articles about all of these various issues that we've discussed. And I don't know what the future holds beyond that. Maybe at some point I'll write another book or do another documentary, but I'm really enjoying this moment in time, celebrating some of the work that we've done and that we're in the process of doing. And if people are interested in learning more, they can visit reducetarian.org or meetmehalfway.org, or they can come to our conference or follow us on all the fancy social media platforms that exist today.
And for the vegans that are listening, tell them what they will get out of the Reducetarian Summit. They might be thinking, "Oh, I'm not reduced. I'm completely eliminated. What will I gain or become enriched with from the summit?"
Yeah, the Reducetarian Summit really isn't focused on changing individual diets. We're there because we all recognize the problem with factory farming, and we want to be advocates, not necessarily for changing each other, but for changing people that are not coming to the Reducetarian Summit. So folks are going to be learning about all of the different tools and resources that are out there, whether that's policy or technology or legal or marketing or education. We also bring a lot of really mainstream folks. So a lot of impressive media representatives from various different outlets, everything from the New York Times and Forbes and Fast Company and so on. There are investors that come to our event if folks are interested in working to receive funding for their, let's say, alternative protein company. There are foundations and philanthropists that are come looking for opportunities to donate funds to promising advocates and nonprofits. So there's a lot of really exciting opportunities. I also think if there's an opportunity to connect with people who are not vegan, more than 50% of our audience is not vegan. And the best way to learn about the people that you want to inspire is to hang out with those people. We're really not going to be successful as a movement if we all go to vegan potlucks and go to vegan restaurants. We have to hang out with and get to know people who are not like us. It is challenging to be with people you don't agree with on every topic, but it is the only way forward. And that's my favorite part about the summit. Not everyone agrees with everyone, but we put all that aside to advance our shared goal for reducing societal consumption of animal products.
Thank you for that.
Hey, folks. Okay, back by very popular demand is our plant-powered plate fridge magnet, which you are going to receive for free if you leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. So here are the details. Just write your quick review. Does not need to be long, does not need to be a whole story. Just be honest and speak from the heart. Then take a quick screenshot of the review you wrote and email it to us at podcast@switch4good.org. That's podcast@switch4good.org. And include your mailing address so we can send you a power plate. We are doing this because the more reviews we garner, the higher we go in search results, which means more folks will learn about our podcast. So the power is in your hands. Leave us a review and zoom, your power plate arrives at your doorstep.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the Switch for Good, please visit us at switch4good.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to Switch for Good. This is the future.